And as in the introduction, my background is in political science and actually human trafficking and sex trafficking and bonded labor. I feel slightly uncomfortable being an Anglo-Saxon woman talking about my research in India. But basically, the way I'm approaching this, and I'll give you a little bit of background into what the research I've been doing is I'm going to give you an overview of the situation of the girl child in India. And I'd like to open it up to a discussion about what the solutions are, because I truthfully do not know what the solutions are. I'm very well aware of cultural relativism versus universalism and rights, and so I find it, particularly once again being an Anglo-Saxon, to pass my judgments in my concepts of what human rights are in a culture that's so very different, basically. And so what I'm going to do is give you an overview of my observations and what I think maybe one of the solutions are, and then maybe open it up for discourse and debate, basically. So my research actually, I have a colleague who I've written in, she's an anthropologist at Sambalpur University, and so basically I'm going to give you an overview of the situation in India, and at the same time intersperse a little bit of the study that we've been carrying out on more of a micro level in the region where the university is, where we've conducted interviews with 250 people of adolescent girls between the ages of 15 and 18. And also conducted interviews with their parents about the whole situation of a girl child in India. And so I'm interspersing both. I never know what the background is of my audience, and so hence I'm giving you a general overview of the situation and interspersing some of my experiences. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So the first slide. I always like to open it up, my presentations, with two quotes. And one of them is Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India. You can tell the condition of a nation by looking at the status of its women. A lofty ideal. The second quote is from, he was a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Indian Supreme Court. It's a little bit longer, but the fight for gender inequality, well, I guess you can read it, right? Would you like me to read? Okay. The fight for gender equality is not a fight against men. It's a fight against traditions that have chained them. A fight against attitudes that are ingrained in the society, which I think is one of the perplexing issues I find with India, basically. It's a fight against the system, a fight against the proverbial Lakshman Rekha, which is different for men and different for women. The society must rise to the occasion. It must recognize and accept the fact that men and women are equal partners in life. They are individuals who have their own identity. And so we have two very lofty ideals here, and now I'm going to go through the reality, basically. Approximately every year, 12 million girls are born in India, and 25% of them do not survive their 15th birthday. And, 750,000 girls are aborted every year in India, and that statistic is from the United Nations in 2001. The figure is a little bit better. I'll go in more detail with regional sort of statistics of 2011 from the Indian census. But this is sort of basically what we're looking at in India. And so now I thought I'd go through a little bit of legal aspects, because actually when I started to read and study the Indian Constitution, I found it to have more elements of human rights in it than the United States Constitution, which I found again sort of rather perplexing to what I was seeing in reality to what I'm seeing in theory here. So both the preamble and the Constitution not only grants equality to women in various articles, it actually also provides to some extent preferential treatment. That we should take into consideration the situation of females, basically. If we move on to the next slide, I can break down sort of the Constitution. So Article 14 is very like what we have in the United States, which is the standard equality before the law. Like, there shall be no discrimination based on religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. And so here we have our gender equality firmly established in the Constitution. Article 15 basically reiterates the same. But Article 15.3 I found very interesting, and this is where I'm not too sure whether I want to use the word progressive or not, but where the Indian Constitution takes a different stand to the United States. And it says, nothing in this article shall prevent the state from making special provisions for women and children. So it's embedded in the Constitution that the Indian government can make special provisions for women and children. The reason I'm skeptical about this type of legal rights is if you go through the history of the United States and you have like this whole protective attitude towards women and children, which was actually, in some respects, a barrier and a hurdle for equality. Because there's one thing to protect women and children, there's another thing to give them equality, if that makes sense. But moving on, Article 16 is sort of reiterating the same aspects again, that there be no discrimination based on race, sex, descent, etc. Article 51A is another one that actually makes a specific mention of women again, to renounce practices that are derogatory to the dignity of women. These are things that are embedded in the Indian Constitution, right? And then the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment actually grants a third of seats of elected officers in rural and urban bodies are reserved to women. And it has the same provisions in terms of caste as well. And so constitutionally, the Indian Constitution seems to afford a lot of protections and rights for women. In my observations, I was witness to many women's empowerment projects, which I found, like, at first a little bit, well, here's the Constitution, there are all these rights given to women, and yet here I found these women's empowerment projects with women who didn't know how to read or write, didn't know how to use a cell phone because they're not familiar with the numbers and things. And so these are sort of like learning basic, like, mathematics, basically, right? 2 times 1 equals 2 type of thing, right? These are like women who were married at an early age who have no form of formal education whatsoever. And the next slide is just another example of the empowerment projects that we were witness to. And so I found all of this quite perplexing in many respects. And so to move on, I'm sorry, because I like photography, I throw images in now and then. So now looking at children specifically. So we've looked at women and now looking at the constitutional provisions for children in the Indian Constitution. Article 23 and 24, no child below 14 must be employed in mines or in hazardous employment practices. In reality, that is not at all true. My friend, who's the photographer who took the photographs who were outside, he and I visited brick kilns and spent days in them, and there were many children working in the brick kilns. So what you have is sort of like the constitutional provisions, the legal the legislation, and yet in practice it's not being enforced, and that's sort of the dilemma, basically. Article 45, the state will provide free compulsory education for all children up to 14. And so the provisions are there to protect both a woman and children, females and children. Article 39, children will be given the opportunities and facilities to develop in a healthy manner. One of the things I've observed, and it's part of what I think might be a solution, is constitutionally in India, and if we move to the next slide, well, I'll mention it now. I was going to mention it in a short while, but constitutionally in India, we have provisions that protect women. In international law, we have provisions that protect the equality of women, empowerment of women, and then we have a lot of constitutional provisions, legislation, international protocols, etc., that protect children. And yet we have never really differentiated. We're lumping children together as children rather than maybe looking at that gender distinction earlier. And I personally think if we started to look at that a little bit more, that might be a way of dealing with the condition of the girl child in India. Is basically, and I'll reiterate that in a short while. But just to quickly go through all the provisions that are there for protecting women and children. Laws in India, the sati, which was the widow burning when her husband died and the widow was put on top of the funeral pyre and died with her husband, has been outlawed. The Child Marriage Restraint Act in 1929, which was sort of put the legal age of marriage at 14, in 1976 made the legal age 18. In practice, in reality, that is not the situation. Basically, the Hindu Marriage Act actually made provisions for divorce. The Dowry Prohibition Act was passed in 1961, which outlawed the whole concept of dowry, except, again, and I'll explain a little bit later. The Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, 1971. Both of these, the next two, are dealing with sex selection, basically, and selective abortion based on the sex of your child, or designed to try and prevent sex selection, basically. And then we have a national policy for the endowment of women that was passed in 2001. The next slide, the laws with provisions for children. The 86th Amendment, 2002, primary education is a fundamental right. We have the Protection of Child Rights Act that was passed in 2005. We have a National Commission for the Protection of Child Rights, which was an offshoot from the act that was passed in 2005. And here is the first time we actually see a national plan of action where we're specifically mentioning the girl child, like in terms of a legal setting. And then the right of children to free and compulsory education. Okay. And of course, India is a co-signatory to both the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And a lot of the provisions have been implemented into the legislation. So legally, everything is there, basically, right? So what's the reality? Or what was my observations from my time in India? Okay, next slide. Yeah, I could just put them all, actually. I prefer when they all come. Okay. In terms of observation, feticide, access to education are things I'm going to sort of briefly discuss, access to healthcare, nutrition, overwork, mistreatment, and this powerlessness. Just briefly, how I ended up doing research on the girl child. I'd originally gone to India for my fellowship, was on studying trafficking practices in India and patterns. And I was teaching a graduate class in the social work department and a graduate class in anthropology. And I was just sitting talking to educated females about what their future was, what they wanted to do. And virtually, I want to say, like, almost all apart from one student said that they can't wait until they get married. And I said, well, but what about your studies and what are you going to do once you're married? And then the response was, well, it will depend on my in-laws. And it'll depend on if my in-laws allow me to work. And so I said, oh. And then I sort of moderated a roundtable discussion with postdoctoral students. And so here we have really educated women in India, and the relation to the girl child is these are going to be mothers one day, right? And so they're living within this very confined environment that I found hard to sort of comprehend. And basically, these postdoctoral students talked about their lives, and that basically they get up about 4 o'clock in the morning, because most of them were married. They get up about 4 o'clock in the morning. They have to make sure they do all the chores and everything that's required of them in their in-laws' house before then they can go to the job situation at the university. And even then, their father-in-laws escorted them to the university and back. And so they had this very limited sort of freedom that I found really hard to comprehend. But then, as I say, I go back in my own mind that I have these Western ideals, I have these concepts of universal human rights, and this is a completely different culture. And so I have these dilemmas between cultural relativism and what you do when they're at odds with what we deem as universal human rights. And so that's how I ended up moving into this area of study and looking more closely at the girl child. So basically what you see, which is fairly common in India, is there's a preference towards a boy child. Right, and it's fairly ingrained and embedded in most societies. This is not only in rural areas, it's in urban areas. It's not just in scheduled castes, it's in all castes. It crosses economic, so upper class, lower class. It crosses all of these dimensions, basically. And so there's a quote here that's very commonly said, and I actually went to a wedding and I heard it being mentioned more than once by many of the in-laws, is, "May you be the mother of 100 sons." And we will see why maybe this preference is... Huh?
It says sons, not daughters. So you should better have boys, not girls.
Yes, yeah. Actually, I thought, I don't know that I put a typo when you said that. I thought I had it wrong, yes, yeah. And so where are the roots of this male child preference, basically? And then how it sort of manifests, and then sort of like what it must be like. I started to think what it must be like to be a girl child living in India, and what all these social norms must do to a female, basically. The preference for a son is motivated by economic, religious, social desires. It's deeply entrenched in traditions and culture. And so that's where the dilemmas seem to occur, basically. The next one. I'm not an expert on Hindu religion, but just like in my delving into it a little bit, the Hindu religion lays a great stress on the birth of a son. Obviously, India is a patriarchal society. Of course, it's the son that continues the family lineage in most cultures, in terms of name, at least. In India, a man cannot obtain moksha, etc., unless he has a son who will light the funeral pyre. And so there's this emphasis on male children. And I also found if a woman gives birth to only daughters, that she can be left in her 11th year of marriage, so that a man can pursue another wife who can maybe give them a female child, where I'm not in terms of genetics and biology, but I think it's the Y chromosome that actually, so it's a man who carries the gene of male, not the woman whatsoever. But a man has a right to go and find another wife who may give him a son. Good luck with that, I guess, in that sense, because biologically it's not going to happen. So the economic factors, I'm breaking them down, is the dowry payment, and that's demanded by a groom's family. If you remember the legislation, dowries have been prohibited, but they are still practiced in virtually every family. Even if it's maybe more the informal way of giving gifts like a house, etc. But what I did find with the dowry is it's an ongoing war. Basically, it doesn't end with a marriage. It continues. And so basically, if a woman becomes pregnant, then it's her family who then are often asked to help with the payment, the costs of the hospital, etc., and things. And so it seems to be it's an ongoing dispute about how much money that the other family is going to give. And of course, the dowry is always the female that gives the dowry, because what happens in Indian culture usually is the man stays in his own home. And so when a girl gets married, she then moves in with her in-laws, basically, unless it's a nuclear family. I mean, there is progress in India, but basically what happens is when a couple marry, the girl then moves in with the in-laws and then has to adapt to the new setting, basically. And so I guess that's where the dowry comes in, because now you're giving your daughter away, basically, to another family. And I think, again, that's where this preference comes in, because a female child is seen as transitory. Like, she's only in this house for so long, and then she's going to become part of another family. Right? Whereas your son is going to stay with you. He's going to bring wealth into your family, and he's going to take care of you in your old age, so to speak. And so you can sort of see where this preference for the male child is sort of emerging from in that sense. The average cost of a dowry is approximately 35 lakhs, which is about 75,000 US dollars. It varies in terms of like income levels, but it seems like from the study I did, it seems like there's approximately 2/3 of somebody's wealth can sort of go to a dowry, basically. When I did my research on labor, a lot of people who were in bonded labor situations was because they had borrowed so much money to pay for their daughter's wedding. And then often what happens, and again, I mean, I hate making like these overgeneralized statements because it does vary. But often what happens is the status of a bride in her husband's family is related to the amount of dowry that she brought. And sort of like talking to a lot of my students, and then the study we did with the 16 to 18-year-olds, that was like an overriding sort of discussion and factor that came like, well, what's the status of different sort of daughter-in-laws? Well, it depends on how much dowry the person brought in and things like that. So. And of course, there are dowry-related deaths. And I, as a political scientist and doing research on sex trafficking and hard-to-reach populations, I hate giving statistics. But the one thing I would, because I think they're very inaccurate, basically, and here again, I think it's probably inaccurate. If anything, I would want to say maybe, possibly, there are more. It's very hard to determine. You know, somebody dies because a pot of water, like, sort of goes over them or something. Or I noticed in India when I'm reading a newspaper every day, I look at the section that has like sort of 15-year-old girl, 14-year-old girl sets fire to herself. And I would often look at things and like, why would so many 15-year-old girls set fire to themselves? And so maybe they did, maybe it was a form of suicide, but it's very hard to determine what is accidental, what was suicide, what was maybe somebody deliberate. I mean, I think the statistics are very hard, and so I shy away from them, but to give you an idea. Let's briefly look at the female feticide. These are just some ads that I found, like in my travels. The first two are sort of dealing with like the concepts of have a sex selection, abortion. There's a slogan on, I didn't take a photograph, and it said something like, rather pay 5,000 rupees now than 55,000 later. So in other words, it was like the push to have a sex-selected test, and if your fetus was female, to abort it, because 5,000 was much cheaper than 55,000 later, so to speak. And so the top two are dealing with that. The bottom one was the other. No, it's okay. Go ahead. The sex ratios, to give us some perspective, India, the sex ratio is still the worst. It's 933 to every 1,000 males, followed by Pakistan, China, Bangladesh. These are just some random countries that I gave, and then of course the United States. This is sort of more like your average. The next one. What I did find is there are regional differences, basically. If you look at the northern states, the two worst states for the skewed sex ratios is Punjab and Haryana. Followed by a lot of the northern states. The state down here, Kerala, I don't know if you know anything about, it has like the highest educational levels. It has like 100% literacy for both male and female. It's often like heralded as like one of the best states in terms of education. And then the other state that's also very high is Puducherry. They're both close in the southern states. And they have lower sex ratios. And so you could look at maybe like educational values, but it's not necessarily true, because when I started to look more closely at Haryana and Punjab, I found like skewed sex ratios with educated people as well. And so it's just really hard to sort of figure out a lot of this. Sorry. The next slide. Then this is just again from the census of India. It just shows you in a different form that you're looking at Haryana. This is 2001 actually. And then you have the 2011 to give you some perspective of the changes slightly. So then something like this, the sex ratio is sort of changing for the better, basically. But it's a slow progress. Next one. And that's just breaking it down by states. So if you have a look, like the northern states here have the worst ratios. And then the southern states, again, that have the higher educational levels have the higher ratios. And like I say, in terms of preventative legislation, there's the Medical Termination Pregnancy Act of 1971. When that was created, it was designed to, it actually legalized abortion, but at the same time, the reason of the act was it was designed to prevent the backstreet abortions that were taking place, and so to sort of like be able to regulate like sex determination tests and things. But it actually evolved into increasing the amount of sex-selected abortions, actually. And so then the Indian government later passed the prenatal diagnostic techniques test, which outlawed sex selection tests. And so when a woman is pregnant and she goes for like the ultrasounds, the doctors are not supposed to ever tell them the sex of the child, basically. Education. They can move the slides, it's just my images. So basically what I'm trying to show here, there's all these provisions in place for education, and my observations were most young girls do go to school, and do go to school up to like the ages of 10 to 14, and that's where you start to see a dropout rate. So like where I was in the carpet belt sector, they had education programs. The next one. Goodweave is an international NGO that sort of monitors sort of fair practices in the very beautiful rugs that a lot of people have to prevent child labor. They have their own education programs for children with emphasis on female children. But let's again look at the reality. The next slide. And again, the former Chief Justice here is sort of observation in terms of the reality. From a quote that he made at an international conference in 2008, I thought was interesting. He said, oh, sorry, that was mine because I had to make breakfast, sorry. I'm so sorry, I've turned it off on every time. Yeah, the food is very good here, I have to say. Yeah. But just as a random observation in 2008 at an international conference, he said out of every 20 people in the world, 3 are Indians in terms of population. Out of those 3, 1 is illiterate, and out of 10 illiterates in India, 6 are girls. Basically, even at the stage of enrollment of girls and boys in schools, boys and girls in schools, there's a growing gap of 21.7 points. There's a high dropout rate among girls compared to boys. So despite the fact you have Articles 14 and 15 of the Constitution, they're violated with impunity, basically. And of course, studies have shown that failure to educate a girl or child has a negative impact on infant mortality, maternal mortality, and hygiene, right, basically, which is true. In my observations from the study we did in Sambalpur of interviewing girls, we found that it was 66% of girls felt as if they had a negative experience with their teachers in school. That their teachers didn't seem to pay much attention to them compared to the male children. And so what you see a lot is you see an awful lot, despite the fact that you have all the legislation and so the de jure aspect is there, you have a lot of de facto discrimination that takes place. And so a lot of girls would like sort of account that they felt very uncomfortable with certain teachers. They found it very hard to get attention of teachers compared to boys. And so you have all the de facto discrimination that makes a girl feel more inferior, basically. In terms of just your statistics in male and female literacy rates, this is just going from 1951 to 2000. As you see, the gap is actually getting slightly better, but still the literacy of females is still much less than men. And when we talk to some of the families, the parents of the girls we interviewed in Sambalpur, they talk a lot about, well, what is the use of educating my daughter past a certain point? Basically, because, you know, what good is it going to do for her when she gets married? Basically. The next one, I think I just broke it down. The rural literacy rates here compared to, and this is from the 2001 Indian census, and then the urban which is the next one. Which again, so this illustrates that in urban areas, obviously you have higher literacy rates, but you still have the gaps between female and male, basically. And it all goes back, I think, to the whole concepts of arranged marriages and dowries, and this whole concept that you have a daughter, but she's transitory in your house because she is ultimately going to belong to somebody else. And so, and of course brings no income into your house whatsoever, no finances. I think it spills over into so many different levels, aspects of India. And then I sort of think, and I go back to the presentation I gave yesterday with the children that we're working with the cameras and the little girl, and I think of, sort of when I talk to her and she talks about, well, she has been taught that she does not eat until after her brothers have eaten, until after like the male members are eaten, and that's ingrained in her at the age of 10. And I sort of used to make jokes because I've gone back now for 3 years, and every time I go back I've noticed that the boys in the camera project have all grown and they've matured, and Priya, who's the little girl, I look at her and I say, you haven't grown, what's going on here? And she still is like a little short person, but she has, it's automatic, it's without even thinking that she waits until her brothers have eaten before she eats. And even then, sort of, even when I moderated the graduate, the postdoctoral female students talked about, oh yes, when I'm at home, even if I accidentally take food before my husband, I automatically know to take the smallest portion of fish or the smallest portion of meat, because it's been ingrained from such a young age that the better food is given to males and to male children. And so attitudes, I think there was more that they come out. Yeah. And also, and this sort of touches, but not really very much, on the concept of the rape culture that's emerged in India after the Delhi rape, is that, and the concept of the rape culture with girls is this attitude that, I don't know whether you followed the Delhi rape, but the attitude that developed was, well, what was she doing out? She's female, and why was she out? Why was she with a male late at night, etc.? And this concept that, well, what do you expect if you're out and you're female, basically? And so parents, that spills over into parents, and parents fear the safety of female children. And that results in like really restricting sort of their movement, etc. Of the girls that we interviewed between the ages of 16 and 18, they talked about the completely different standards for their brothers compared to them and what they had, and they had very restricted sort of movement, mobility. I know of when I would ask sort of my colleagues at the university, how would you like to go for dinner tonight? And I didn't understand, and these were educated professors, female, would say, oh, no. And I thought that they were just being very unfriendly until I realized that even they had ingrained in this attitude of, no, we're just females, right? And so it's not right and acceptable for us to go out together at night unless we had a male faculty member or somebody else with us. I just thought that they were being unfriendly to me. But whenever there was a male faculty member, then it was acceptable to go out. And so these like ingrained attitudes that are coming through from the discrimination from early childhood, basically, with educated professional people. Okay. Oh, and this is the interview of one of the girls' mothers. And this is what she said about her daughter in education. To quote, "I do not prefer to provide very high education for girls. I do not encourage my daughter to go for any technical education. After completing high school, it's important for her to concentrate more on household activities, as this will help her be a good housewife and a good daughter-in-law. Higher education would be meaningless after marriage." And Sasmita's mother was, in the study we did, we had upper class, middle income, and then lower income. And Sasmita's mother was from an upper income family in Sambalpur. And that was her attitude of her daughters. Child marriage, that's still prevalent. The age of marriage in India, and this is from the Indian census, of all of India, and then that the age is very low. It says 17.39, but that's taken into consideration all the rural areas where you still have children being married at 14 and 15, etc. Again, if you remember that northern state, Haryana, has a fairly low level. Bihar, if you remember at all from the map, Bihar is right in the north, bordering on Nepal. Bihar is one of the poorest provinces in India, basically. It has the lowest educational levels. Rajasthan. These ages were astounding to me, of how young. And the detrimental effects of a child marriage, of course, are obviously it cuts off educational opportunities from that point onwards. Then you have all the complications of early childbearing. Girls between the ages of 15 and 19 that give birth are 66% more likely to encounter complications because their bodies are not mature enough to be giving birth at 16 and things. Neonatal mortality rates are higher. They're prone to higher risks of domestic violence. And then, of course, isolation, because a girl moves from her own family environment to this totally new family that she's never met before, and so she's like totally isolated. I had difficulty dealing with translation problems. I had one of my graduate students who was sort of like would take me around and things. She kept saying to me, I went to her house and she said to her neighbor, the daughter-in-law was working in the garden, and she said, oh, look at her, she's tortured. She's tortured all the time. And I said, would you like to define torture to me? Because like in terms of like, you know, what's lost in translation, because that's a very strong word to use. And she said, oh, no, she's like totally sort of discriminated against. She's like treated badly. She's not given like adequate food. And something, really isn't what we class as torture. It's not a very nice situation. But then she told me that she said that when she was about to give birth, they took her to the hospital very last minute because she's the daughter-in-law that they didn't like as much. And my student said, and I said, why? And my student said, well, because she didn't provide as much dowry as the other daughter-in-law and is not seen as favorable. And she had to have a C-section. And then afterwards, when she came home, the family was still having her work and doing like heavy lifting, and she ended up having to be rushed to the hospital because her wound opened, basically. And so now I'm beginning to realize, okay, yeah, it's sort of the concepts of torture, but it seemed to be used a lot as just like of general mistreatment, basically. But sort of why child marriage persists. It's going back to the girls are seen as a liability. And it is sort of the rape culture comes into place here in the sense of the whole concept of honor. Because if a girl is, I've noticed in some of the newspaper articles I read and the interviews I conducted, if a girl is raped and she goes home and tells her family, often the reaction is, don't tell anybody. And we keep this within the family, basically. And even then the attitude is, well, let's see if we can marry her off quickly, because now she's become a liability, even though none of this was her fault whatsoever. The laws seem to be very rarely enforced, in general, is my observation. And what I have noticed in Rajasthan, from my sex trafficking research, Rajasthan has a very bad skewed sex ratio, and so we've noticed sort of like child marriage sex trafficking taking place to accommodate for the lack of females in like states like Rajasthan and Haryana, basically. One of the government programs that I actually worked with some social workers, and we went out into the field because there are programs that are designed to try and prevent child marriage or underage marriage and things, and this is one of them. It's a government health program that provides financial assistance. It started off in rural areas as providing financial assistance to people in the rural areas, and then it also sort of is now being used in urban areas with schedule castes and also with the homeless people in sort of slum areas, basically. And so basically what it does is it's designed to force women into hospitals to give birth, basically. So one of the requirements are that you can get this financial assistance, but you have to come to the hospital. You have to come to the hospital for your prenatal care, and you have to come to the hospital to give birth. And one of the other provisions, and this is where like sort of the law and the reality sort of don't meet, basically, is one of the other provisions is you have to be over the age of 18 before you're pregnant. Right, and so because if you're under, then it's designed to prevent the child pregnancy and marriages. You're not eligible. And I was looking at it and I said, well, that's a good program in that sense. And the social worker I was with, she said, no, it doesn't really work in practice. She said because many of the people that come to her, whether it's in the rural areas or even in the slum areas, they don't have birth certificates. And so I said, well, how do you determine people's age? And she said, well, we just sort of guess. Well, when they ask the person, and the person will say, always say that they're older than 18, but often they're not. And so it's just, and it's at the discretion of the social workers. And so that's where, you know, you have this sort of disjuncture between legislation that seems in theory to work, but in practice it's not working, basically. And what I've noticed is girls are less likely to be vaccinated compared to boys. They're less likely to see doctors. In my talks with Priya, on one day she had a really bad sore throat, and I said to her, did your mum take you to the doctor? And she said, no, but I think my brother gave it to me because he has a really bad sore throat too. And I said, oh, and she said, and he went to the doctor. And I said, but you? And she says, no, I told my mum, but she said, go out and sell the arty, so to speak. And so there she was sitting next to me giving me her sore throat. So they're taught to eat less, as I've mentioned, and they're taught to avoid like nutritious items like meat if it's in scarcity, eggs if it's in scarcity. It's ingrained from like a very young age, basically. And then just sort of briefly, like I think you're probably aware of the cycle of malnutrition and how it manifests itself is girls are breastfed less than boys because of the preference towards boy children. Girls consume less calories, and so then they're malnourished or undernourished. Girls are kept out of school. Most of the children that we're working with, apart from... we've had difficulty finding boys for our camera project. It's very easy to find an abundance of girls because there's a preference to put the boys in school rather than the girls. And so when you reach the age of 14, it's often the girls are kept out of school to take care of older siblings. They're the ones who you find in the tourist areas selling things, and you see much less boys in those areas, basically. And then often forced into the early marriage. And then the cycle just continues, basically. And that's what's the upsetting part. And again, this was a quote from one of the people we interviewed. And I just sort of think of like, I like to try and put myself in the position, if I can, of what it must be like to be a young girl, what it must be like the graduate students to be living in this situation. And one of the quotes from one of the girls was, she said, the insecurity outside of the household is sort of is an obstacle for women. It's dangerous. The whole concept's back to the rape culture, that there are certain parameters that a girl can operate in compared to a boy. Certain things they can't do, like you can't go out and have a drink after work. I mean, that would not be heard of if you're female, and things. But the same thing happens within the house, right? And so, but she was a girl who was telling me about her situation at home. She was married. And she was telling me her situation with her in-laws and how that they didn't really like her very much, and she felt very lonely and isolated. But then she said, like, the outside is sort of like just as awful situation. So, like, for women or young girls, there's no remedies. So in the home, they're discriminated against before they're married, with a lot of the factors that I've outlined. When they get married and they become an in-law, they're discriminated against. And that's the part I could never understand. Why a mother-in-law would discriminate against her daughter-in-law when she has gone through that whole experience herself. Right? Yeah. I mean, that's what happened. Yeah. But it's just, I found that, like, if you've experienced that, why would you do that to your daughter-in-law? It's and so that the cycle continues. But they don't have any comfort in their home, and there's no comfort outside either. It's and she said it's time, sort of basically. I mean, this actually just sums it up. If you go to the next slide, if it's time. So what are the solutions? I'd like to leave it open mostly to the people here, but basically, and this is my dilemma, is what the discrimination is grounded in cultural, traditional, religious norms, right? That might be perceived to be very alien to us, looking at it from a Western perspective. And it goes back to this whole concept of cultural relativism versus universalism. And so I do think that one of the solutions would be to create gender-specific legislation and to acknowledge the difference between girls and boys at a much earlier age. Because if you think about, like, for example, child labor laws, like they were seen and perceived to be very alien to many cultures, right? You know, I have these children, they're here to work for me. Right? I need them to work for me. It's part of my livelihood. But with international legislation and universalism of what we perceive to be a right of a child, it's generally become more accepted in societies. The child labor is bad. And so maybe if we had more legislation that was specific, gender-specific at an earlier age, maybe slowly it would become more accepted that we should not treat girls this way and that they should be treated equally to boys. Because like all the legislation, international laws, it's basically the rights of a child or the right of a woman. But nothing sort of that takes it, sort of, that addresses what you see happening in a lot of South Asia in terms of this skewed treatment towards a girl child compared to a boy. But I have lots of dilemmas myself because I'm coming at this as a Western woman into a whole different sort of culture, basically. And so I feel very uncomfortable to sort of pass any forms of judgments. I wish I was Indian and then I could talk more, but I don't know. But I am very conscious of cultural relativism and all of those things, and I find it harder for me. When I teach foreign policy in my American government classes, I always have to make a disclaimer, because I don't know whether you've figured from my accent, I'm British, and I'm sitting in an American class, and I'm talking about the United States foreign policy, does this, this, and this, and then I suddenly take a step back and think, and the British government also. It is very hard coming in as an outsider and passing any judgments, basically. And so I'd like to just basically leave it open to sort of solutions from outside, I think.